are concerned. So he cast down the 30 pieces of silver in the temple, departed, and went out and hanged himself. This is all out of Matthew 27. So these 30 pieces of silver, where are they now? They're laying on the temple floor, right? Well, the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury because it is the price of blood. There was a rule against that. It was unlawful for the priests to put in the treasury blood money. But you have to remember the chief priests had good CPAs, okay? And they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. In other words, what's lurking behind this is they couldn't take the cash and put it in the treasury. That was against the rules. But what they could do, they decided, was to use the cash to prepay some expenses. The temple was liable. If a stranger died in the precincts, they were liable to take care of the funeral and the arrangements. That was an expense of the temple. They had to find someplace to bury him. Well, there happened to be a potter's field that was a bargain deal right now, so they took the cash, bought the potter's field, so they had a field where they could bury strangers in. They're prepaying anticipated expenses. So they took counsel, brought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in, wherefore that field was called the field of blood unto this day. Well, let's go back to Zechariah 11, verse 13. Notice the details that are in this little verse. The price is 30 pieces of silver. Where does the transaction take place? In the house of the Lord, that is in the temple. Who ends up with the money? The guy that owns the field, the potter. Isn't that wild? What's the probability that that just happened by chance? That was random. If I say less than 1 in 100,000, I could say 1 in a million and pull it off. Let's say 100,000. Let's be cautious, okay? Let's take the next one. This one has a lot of personal impact for me. I'll explain why in a minute. In Zechariah 13, verse 6, there's a strange verse. It says, one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? And then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. I can remember as a teenager coming across this verse, and in those days I was on kind of a kick to collect prophecy verses. So when I found a verse like this, I would type it up on a little card, the verse on one side and the reference on the other, and I'd add it to my collection to try to learn it. And I thought, wow, here's, wounds in his hands and so forth. I thought that's a prophecy of the Messiah. And so I added it to my collection. But as I tried to memorize it, I kept stumbling. It didn't make sense. The more I looked at it, the less sense it made. And one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? And then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Well, the more I thought about it, I had to admit to myself, that didn't fit the mental image I had. I can't visualize Jesus laying out his hands on these 12 by 12s or whatever they were, and them driving spikes into his hand, the Roman soldiers driving spikes into his hands as being wounded in the house of his friends. That just somehow, I had trouble with that. Until I was reading in John chapter 20. You may recall that first night after the Emmaus Road that evening, he appeared to the disciples after his resurrection. But Thomas wasn't with him, all right? The next day, they saw Thomas and said, boy, you should have been at the prayer meeting last night. Guess who showed up? And Thomas expressed his famous doubt. He said unto them, except I shall see in his hands the print of his nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. See, Thomas was from Missouri, as we would say in our provincial format. And well, after 8 days, again, the disciples were within, and Thomas this time was with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace be unto you. Then he went over to Thomas. He said, Thomas, reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach thither thy hand, and thrust it in my side, and be not faithless, but believing. That must have shook up Thomas to realize that Jesus heard every word he says. He hears every word you and I say too. Thomas answered and said unto him, and I visualize Thomas falling on his knees when he says this. It doesn't say that. That's just my interpretation. Thomas answered and said unto him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. Then I suddenly realized that verse in Zechariah 13:6. What are these wounds in thy hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. What wounded Jesus was not the nails. It was Thomas's unbelief. But let's get back to 13:6. How many people taken at random have been wounded in their hands in the house of their friends? Well, if I say less than 1 in 1,000, am I being generous? I think so. Let's take the next one, number 6. We have to always pick at least one or a couple from Isaiah 53. God says through Isaiah, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. And of course, can't help but remark when we see Jesus in those 6 trials that occurred that night, 3 Jewish and 3 Roman trials. He made no defense. How many prisoners accused of a capital crime, in other words, death penalty, make no defense even though they're innocent? I suspect if you scan the records, you could probably find somewhere someone who was innocent that went to an execution without making defense. There probably have been, maybe, some, but if I say there's less than 1 in 1,000, are we together? I think I'm being generous. Okay. Let's take another one from Isaiah. A few verses later, Isaiah says, he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Strange apparent contradiction. His grave is with the wicked, and yet he's with the rich in his death. So the way I usually ask is, how many people have died among the wicked, yet were buried with the rich that were not attorneys? And of course, I'm being flippant here. Seriously, how many people have died among the wicked and buried with the rich? Again, if I say less than 1 in 1,000, am I being generous? I think that the intrinsic paradox could be reflected in a higher number, but let's go on. Let's take just one more, and we can't go through this without going to Psalm. Psalm 22 reads as if it was dictated first person singular as Jesus hung on the cross, even though it was written 800 years earlier. But one of the phrases there we'll pick up on, it says, for the dogs have compassed me, and the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Now what makes this remarkable, this was penned by David 700 years before crucifixion was invented. Remember that in Israel, the form of capital punishment was stoning. When they killed somebody for a crime or whatever, they stoned them. That was the official form of punishment. But here we have, in 700 years, crucifixion was invented by the Persians, about 90 BC. It was adopted heavily by the Romans, of course, and so on. But it was invented by the Persians. But here, this was penned 700 years before the fact, and yet the whole psalm graphically portrays. In fact, there have been articles in the American Medical Association journals taken from Psalm 22 and analyzing the medical cause of death. It's that detailed. But let's get back to this. How many people taken at random have died by having their hands and feet pierced? A lot of people probably have, but if I say less than 1 in 10,000, I think I'm being generous. Because there's so many people killed by so many other methods, I think I'm being generous. 1 in 10,000 being killed by a crucifixion-like method, I think that's fair. Okay, what I've done, I've dragged you through 8 of these. Born in Bethlehem, riding a donkey, presenting himself king on a donkey for 30 pieces of silver. The transaction occurs in the temple, ends up with a potter and all that. There were wounds in the hands, his no defense, though innocent. Died with the wicked, made his grave with the rich, crucified. Okay, we have these estimates, obviously just loose estimates, but we think cautious estimates. The question now is, what is the probability, given, let's assume for discussion purposes, these probabilities are conservative. In other words, the events are actually even more rare than this, but that's fine. What's the probability that a particular person fulfilled all 8 of these? Well, to do this properly, we have to have a feeling for what's called composite probability. So indulge me a little bit further. Let's assume I have a room here of 100 people. And let's assume that 60% of the people in this room are male, and 40% of the people in this room are female. Okay, and let's assume there's 100 of you. What's the probability that if I was blindfolded and I somehow picked one of you at random, that I pick a female? Well, it's pretty obvious. If I have 100 people, I've got 40 females, 60 males, and if they're uniformly mixed up and I touch one, the probability is 40% that I got a female. Are you with me so far? Does that make sense? Okay. Now let me take a different characteristic. Let's assume that I have in this population 60% of you are right-handed and 40% of you are left-handed. And let's also, for the purpose of the discussion, let's assume that those attributes are uniformly distributed. There isn't a tendency for men or women to be one or the other. Let's assume for this discussion that their attributes uniformly distributed. So what's the probability if I blindfolded, touched one of you, got somebody that was left-handed? Again, it would be what, 40%? 40 of you are left-handed, 60 of you are right-handed. If you're mixed up uniformly, I touch one of you, there's a 40% chance. Okay, and the reason I'm building this